Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Dynasty Trust Planning. The webinar will last approximately 15 minutes, and at the end, you will be given an opportunity to receive supporting materials by email. You will also be told how you may email questions related to today's content to the presenter. Today's presenter is Linus Sugis. Linus worked for a Chicago-based insurance company in various roles, including Director of Advanced Sales and as Chief Marketing Officer. He ran and sold a successful estate planning law practice in Franklin, Tennessee. Linus also writes the publication Think About It, founded by life insurance industry guru Steve Leinberg, and Linus still regularly speaks at industry events. Normally, we would do a poll right now, but we would be talking about the January webinar, and in January, we will do a version of the updated numbers that financial planners need to know. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Linus.
Welcome, everyone. We're pleased that you've joined us for today's webinar titled Dynasty Trust Planning. Before we get started, please permit me to remind you of the next two webinars that are upcoming, the first of which is Estate Tax Mistake, Costs the Family $1.5 million. We have these free webinars on the first Wednesday of every month at 11 o'clock Central, and that one is no different. It will be on Wednesday, December 3rd at 11 o'clock Central. Our webinars are free and open to all who are in the financial services business. If you know of someone who would have an interest in December's topic, feel welcome to invite them to attend the seminar. Also, in January, we'll be having our 2026 numbers webinar. We'll talk about updated numbers in pension, in IRAs, in taxes, useful numbers that are important to those in the life insurance business and in the financial services business. As with our December and all of our webinars, this will be on the first Wednesday of the month. That's January 7th of 2026 at 11 o'clock Central Time. Again, if you know somebody who would get some use out of the webinar, somebody who's in the insurance or financial services business, feel welcome to invite them to the January webinar. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's talk about Dynasty Trust Planning. I want to talk about four main areas in Dynasty Trust Planning. First, we'll talk about how somebody might make a dynasty trust or what a dynasty trust looks like. Next, we'll talk about a little bit about generation skipping tax rules. Generation skipping tax rules are really, really complicated, and so in just a few minutes, we're certainly not going to do those rules justice, but we'll give you a bit of an overview that might be useful to you. We'll talk about the rule against perpetuities. Many states limit the duration of a trust or other types of plans. You can't let a trust last forever in many states, is what that means. And we'll talk a little bit about the state rules and how potentially those rules can be managed. And then finally, we'll talk about who might be a prospect for dynasty trust planning. So let's go ahead and get started with that. And let's start with, first of all, making a dynasty trust. What is a dynasty trust, first of all? A dynasty trust is a trust that is designed to last for several generations and potentially make financial provisions for relatives that the grantor, the person doing the planning, may not yet know. It might be people that the grantor does know, but in a lot of cases, it's people that the grantor does not yet know. That's what makes a trust a dynasty trust. And when a client comes to you and says that they've got a dynasty trust, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the full story. A dynasty trust can look like certain other kinds of trusts, because those other types of trusts, or trusts that have those types of labels, can have dynasty provisions in them. For example, an irrevocable life insurance trust may be designed to last for many generations, and thus also be a dynasty trust. It's possible for a revocable living trust, a trust designed to avoid probate. It might have dynasty trust provisions in it. Testamentary trusts could have those types of provisions, asset protection trusts, Medicaid planning trusts. You get the point. All kinds of trusts can have dynasty provisions in them. And so if a client tells you they've got a dynasty trust, your best practice is to ask for a copy of it, because you want to know in more detail what it is that the client's actually trying to accomplish. Those who create dynasty trusts generally have to take care of some other issues, or think about some other issues when they're taking care of future generations. One of those issues is generation skipping taxes, and another of those issues is the rule against perpetuities. Let's shift a little bit and talk a little bit about both of those, starting with the generation skipping tax. I think in order to understand the generation skipping tax, there's no better way to do it than to go through an example. And I'm going to be showing my age here, but let's put up an example and start with Grandpa Munster, who is planning his estate, and he's got some longevity, and he's made some careful investments along the way, and he's accumulated an estate that is worth $30 million. And let's say that when Grandpa Munster is thinking about who ought to get his wealth, he makes some interesting decisions. He's decided that his son, Herman, doesn't really need to inherit wealth from him. Herman and Lily are self-sufficient financially, but Grandpa really wants to take care of his grandson, Eddie, because Grandpa feels like Eddie is really following in his footsteps. So Grandpa really wants to skip a generation in terms of who gets the benefit of his estate. And Grandpa has emotional reasons for wanting to do this, but there are also financial reasons for doing it. If there were no generation skipping transfer tax, at Grandpa's death, if Grandpa implements this plan where he sends all his wealth to Eddie, Eddie would inherit the $30 million estate, and the reduction for federal estate taxes, assuming that the death occurs in 2026, and we've got a $15 million federal estate tax exemption. The first 15 of the 30 would be exempt from estate taxes. The other 15 would be taxed at a rate of 40%, making an estate tax bill of $6 million. While that is significant, from the IRS's perspective, they're looking at this and saying, hey, we weren't able to collect estate tax at Herman's generation. Grandpa skipped a generation, and therefore we don't like that. And so what did the federal government do? Well, to close that loophole, if you want to call it a loophole, the generation skipping transfer tax was created. The federal government collects estate tax plus generation skipping tax if Grandpa's estate plan skips Herman's generation in favor of Eddie. And the current generation skipping tax rate is the same 40% as the federal estate tax rate. So the government is going to collect not only 40% estate tax on the amount transferred to Eddie, it's also going to collect 40% generation skipping tax on an amount sent directly to Eddie. Therefore, the government has figured it out and is collecting the extra tax that would otherwise be missed if Grandpa had left stuff to Eddie and there were no extra generation skipping tax. The generation skipping tax fills that gap and keeps Grandpa from being able to avoid the tax at the middle generation. Now, that's a really simple example. There are lots of rules around generation skipping taxes that I'm not going to cover here. There are ways to manage the generation skipping tax through the use of certain exemptions or certain kinds of planning that people need to think about. But it's important to understand the basics of what the generation skipping tax is before going into those exceptions and those ways to manage the tax. You can do your own research or read some of our stuff if you want to learn more about the generation skipping tax. But that's a reasonably simple overview. Now, I said earlier that the generation skipping tax is one issue that dynasty trust planners need to think about. Another issue is the rule against perpetuities. What is the rule against perpetuities? Well, in the past, under common law, right, before the states started to implement their own rules about perpetuities, under common law, a trust was limited in its duration. It could only last 90 years from the time of the trust creations or 21 years after the death of a trust beneficiary who was alive at the time of the trust creation, whichever was longer. But you can see that, that really limits how long a trust can last. And the government had a public policy to try to keep wealth from lasting through multiple generations, to keep I suppose, to keep the American economic system, the capitalist system fairer, to keep people who were able to accumulate a really high amount of wealth in one generation to keep them from keeping their subsequent generations from having an unfair advantage. Well, the rule against perpetuities was kind of examined by some of the states in more recent years. And some have chosen to keep the old rule, while others have extended the deadline. Tennessee, for example, trust durations are allowed for as long as 360 years, which is just about as long as any of us can imagine, I think. And still others, such as Wisconsin, they've effectively repealed the rules against perpetuities and theoretically would allow a dynasty trust to last forever. So does that mean that your clients who are in one state like Alabama, which has kept the old rule, are precluded from being able to do dynasty trust planning? And the answer to that is no. If you're working with an estate planning attorney who is familiar with these types of issues, in a lot of cases, the trust document itself can make a choice about which state law it's going to be governed by. There may be certain requirements that have to be put into the trust rules to elect to choose a state like Wisconsin, for example. But those choices are available, and clients who are determined to do dynasty trust planning are determined to make their trust last longer than 90 years from the time the trust was created or 21 years after the death of the last living trust beneficiary, right? If they want them to last longer, they can do it by making a choice about which state the trust is going to be governed by, which state law the trust is going to be governed by. So that is possible these days. So who is it that we should be thinking about discussing dynasty planning with? Well, I think the first obvious example is somebody who says they've got a dynasty trust and they want our help with figuring out what to do about it. So if a client says that, I think from my perspective, you've heard me say it before in this webinar, ask for a copy of the trust so that you really know what it is that you're dealing with and what issues might come up. But very wealthy clients who have an interest in sharing their wealth over multiple generations, they're obvious candidates for dynasty trust planning. There may be opportunities to manage the generation skipping tax, and those techniques may involve the use of life insurance. So we should encourage those thoughts of wealthy clients to do dynasty trust planning. We should be prepared to discuss dynasty planning with older clients who may have problematic relationships with one or more of their children, right? If one or more of their children are in a marriage situation that the parents aren't crazy about, or maybe they have, God forbid, substance abuse problems, and the older generation, particularly a wealthy older generation, wants to take care of grandkids to the exclusion of kids. We need to think about whether dynasty planning is a fit, and think particularly about how generation skipping taxes might affect their planning. And then finally, again, this is wealthy clients, but motivated by family legacies, want their family name to last a long time. They might be candidates to think about dynasty trust planning. So what are the takeaways that I hope that you take away from today's session? Well, first of all, as we talked about, clients can achieve their multi-generation planning goals in different ways with different kinds of trusts, with different kinds of estate planning documents. They should certainly talk with their estate planning attorney about what ways might be the right fit, and we should seek to involve ourselves in those conversations because there may be lots of life insurance or financial planning opportunities. Clients refer to all kinds of trusts as dynasty trusts. Get a copy of them to know what you're actually dealing with. And then finally, good dynasty planning involves consideration of the generation skipping tax and rule against perpetuities issues. So I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. As a reminder, if you would like to receive the supporting materials I mentioned during the webinar, feel welcome to email us at asktheexpert@advancedunderwriting.com. You may also email questions related to today's content. Feel welcome to join us for the next webinar on the first Wednesday of next month, December 3rd. At this same time, next month's webinar will be titled Estate Tax Mistake Costs Family $1.5 million. You can also find an archive of past webinars on our YouTube channel, Advanced Underwriting Consultants. Please subscribe to our channel. It helps us to keep making free webinar content. Today's presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel by the end of this week. And finally, for more information about the services that Advanced Underwriting Consultants offer, including phone consultation and newsletter licensing, feel welcome to contact us at 615-224-1291. That's 615-224-1291. Thanks again and best wishes for continued success.